great to be back in Cape Breton. I grew up here with my 9 siblings, not too far from here, and my wonderful mother, Jean, really managed through crowd control, as you can imagine. It was a very busy house. And sometimes I wonder whether or not she operated by the 5 stitches rule. And that meant that if your cut wasn't deep enough so that you needed more than 5 stitches, you don't go to the hospital. And she used to repeat to us from time to time that what won't kill you will make you stronger. How many of us have heard that expression in our lives? And how many of us have actually experienced that kind of thing in our lives? For the record, most of the hands have gone up in the room. So this comes from the concept that difficulty is actually our teacher. And in my talk today, I would like you to stretch that concept from difficulty being our teacher to actually difference being our teacher. And in fact, the question that I would like you to consider is that those least like us and most opposed to us are the ones that have the most to teach us. And this has implications across politics, power, the environment, justice, equality, you name your issue. So my path on this journey started 23 years ago when I was about to be a father of my first son, Patrick Graham. And I had an embarrassingly shallow list of accomplishments that he already had made before he was born. He was going to be handsome and smart and worldly and most of all humble. But my son Patrick had other ideas. The little infant boy that looked back at me on the day that he was born had Down syndrome. And we learned that when the doctor left our room in the hospital on the day that he was born. And at that point, I started to think of all my expectations. And I sat at the end of the bed, and Sheila Nolan, my wife, with Patrick, looked at me, and suddenly she saw that I was weeping softly. And like a mother bear who was nursing her cub, she looked at me and she said, "Danny, we will have none of that. Let go of those expectations. This boy is a gift to us, and he will bring us more than perhaps anyone else we know." No truer words were spoken. For parents of children who were born with differences, the days following the birth are really this odd time because people come up to you on the one hand and some are saying congratulations and others are coming up and saying, giving you condolences. So wanting to put at ease those people who are giving us condolences, I had a standard response. I said, this is just fine. We're going to be great. And in fact, Sheila and I have a lot of experience with people with Down syndrome, and we love how bubbly and good-natured they are. But I don't know how those parents of children with autism manage with their antisocial behaviors. You know that part in the movie where there's some foreshadowing and you say, oh no, I think I know what's going to happen next? This is it. So Patrick's development progressed typically for the first 9 years of his life. He was indeed funny, charming, handsome, engaging. But of course, he also was slow to learn to walk and to talk and to read, which meant that for us as parents, it changed our lens. It changed our perspective on the world. We had to slow down. We had to be more patient. We had to be more open-minded. We had to lose our judgment. We had to attach ourselves less to status about what somebody would become. But that fellow who was 9 years previous saying to himself, my son will be this, started to sort of creep into the picture again. And I started to think to myself, well, perhaps my son, because he's so handsome and because he's so charming, will be the most charming and handsome young guy with Down syndrome that anybody's ever seen. The picture in my mind was Super Patrick. This is a picture of Patrick one Halloween. And he was, for me, like Superman in that moment, and he is to this day in so many respects. Everything changed around his 9th birthday. Without explanation, Patrick lost his language, he lost his ability to socialize, his personality changed fundamentally, and the questions that we held for ourselves was, where did our Patrick go? What happened to that son that we used to have? And we've spent every year since then in many cities with many doctors trying to figure out the answer to that. But what we've come to understand is that he taught us even more. What actually happened is that I was able to let go of any expectation of who he might become and just love him for who he is. The lessons that he gave us in the first 9 years actually were put on steroids after this challenge that we were faced with again. And we learned at that time that beauty, possibilities, and joy exist in everything and every experience we had. And the most significant thing that we learned in that process was that the more Patrick became different than us, the deeper our learning became. I was a defense lawyer. And the greatest surprise that I got as a defense lawyer was that I really liked my clients. Eventually, Sheila took exception to this when I started to bring them home on a regular basis for supper. But I would tell her that, these people have stories, and most of them were found guilty or pled guilty in court. So I ended up explaining to a court, to a judge, so often the stories of people who came from family violence and addictions and illiteracy and mental health issues and racism. Those were the stories that I told the court, and I felt like I was more of a storyteller than anything else. And what I came to believe is that everybody has a story. That was the experience that I got. But my clients, of course, were cycling in and out of the criminal justice system like a conveyor belt. They were going in one end, coming out the other, learning nothing. And I thought to myself, man, if I like the offenders this much, just imagine how much I might like the victims. And so this led me to a process of victim and offender reconciliation, a process that's known commonly as restorative justice, where I became an advocate for restorative justice in many places, bringing people together across their differences. What amazed me most was just how big a bridge could be brought together when you brought people together with such different experiences of an incident. A victim and an offender coming together, reaching an understanding. And what I came to learn was in fact that only they had what the other one needed. A real sense of understanding about the experience, a real sense of healing and closure and moving on. Only these people at polar opposites could actually give this to each other. And it may seem like a strange idea that these great differences could be so important to each other. But that's exactly what that experience was in those circumstances. We often set up rules as adults about the way the world should be that really don't make much sense and kids can see through. Which reminds me of an experience when my 5-year-old son, Andrew, in grade primary said to his class, as a matter of fact, "My dad has friends who are robbers." Needless to say, I heard about that at the next parent-teacher interview. But the point of it is that we set up so many rules that even kids can see through that don't make sense in our society. And there's perhaps no place where that principle applies most than to the world of politics. The crucible of criticism, the place of blame. We're right, they're wrong. We understand you, they don't. We love you, they don't. Fed by a media who torque up the conflict that happens in the first place in order to sell their newspapers or their media outlet advertising on the same basis. And fed into a people who sadly are given a world through that media and through television and so many other places, a story about the world that just has good guys and bad guys, us and them, nothing subtle in between. And so this game of blame and conflict and selling newspapers and seeing only good guys and bad guys gets torqued up more and more. And it's so destructive to our public processes. As Steve mentioned, I was a politician. Early in my time as a political leader, I can remember when the government was about to hold a press conference and I was sitting with my caucus and they turned to me and said, "Go over there and criticize." And on the walk over to the press conference, I realized it's actually a good idea, what they are saying. So after going to the press conference and saying that government's plans are actually pretty good, I returned to my caucus, and to my surprise, they actually forgave my altruistic sin. What I was particularly surprised by, however, was the response of the media. A few days later, a meeting was arranged between me and a member of the press gallery. And during that meeting, I was to be told the facts of life, the way the game was played. And I was told that the press gallery had already considered that if I'm not going to be more negative, if I'm not going to oppose more, then they're going to stop covering me. I took a breath. And then I took the bait. So for the months after that, I became one of those hypercritical scallywags who you complain about all the time. But eventually, I caught myself. And it came in a moment, again with my caucus, where I said to them, I don't care whether or not this is good policy for the people. We'll worry about that later. What I want are the 4 ideas that are going to take this government down and ensure that we win the next election. What I realized after I heard myself say that is that I had forsaken everything that Patrick had taught me about openness and acceptance and non-judgment. I had lost all that my clients had told me and victims had told me about everybody having a story. I just wanted the win. I wanted to be right. But if I can have friends who are robbers, surely I can understand and appreciate and applaud the good ideas of my political opponents. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for you? Who is most different from you? In color, worldview, values, philosophy, lifestyle, who is most different from you right now? Think about it. Against whom are you most opposed in the beliefs that you have? Consider this. Perhaps they are the ones that have the most to teach you. So the liberal has the most to learn from the conservative, the Democrat from the Republican, the environmentalist from the industrialist, the Christian from the Muslim, the disadvantaged from the advantaged, the disabled from the abled, and all of this in reverse. So, of course, from each other in both directions. That's a big ask, I know, especially for those who are disadvantaged and excluded. Especially in a world where there's so much apparent discrimination in so many places. And we have so many environmental issues. But it feels to me like it's the only way forward. Feels to me like this is the path that we have to follow in order for us to get to where we need to be. And that path is more personal than I ever expected or I ever imagined. It's one where we have to actually look first inside ourselves deeply and to understand ourselves deeply, and then begin to try to understand others deeply and our relationship to them. The invitation is to change. The invitation is to be the change. This idea of change motivated me when I was a political leader once in a way that where I wanted to say a poem about change from an author unknown one time. And my very experienced team sort of turned an eyebrow up at me and finally said, "Danny, we don't do poems in politics." And I don't have many regrets from my time in politics, but one regret is that I didn't say that poem. And I'd like to dedicate it to the memory of my wife and to my teacher. This guy. Picture was taken this week. And the poem goes, if you always believe what you've always believed, you will always feel the way you've always felt. If you always feel the way you've always felt, you will always think the way you've always thought. If you always think the way you've always thought, you will always do what you've always done. If you always do what you've always done, you will always get what you've always gotten. If there is no change, there is no change. Thank you very much.